Apologize for the mess. But making this video here today to try to help some people on a casual point understand power levels of a deck. Today I'm going to talk about 3 different decks. And forewarning, I haven't upgraded them in a while, so if you see cards that should go in them, yeah, I probably realize that. But we're just going to talk about how I went through and built them and how I ascertained power level. Because each one was meant to play against a different power level of people or somewhere in between. So the 3 decks I'm going to talk about today that I have built are Sir Conrad, we're going to talk about Chatterfang, and then we're going to talk about Selenia. And we're not so much going to talk about the cards that could go in them, but kind of how I ascertain the power level without ever having to get these decks checked. And everyone I've ever played against is pretty comfortable, and honestly I usually have a pretty good amount of fun playing with them. You know, the decks feel comfortable within their power levels. They feel comfortable against other decks that I subscribe to that kind of power level. But, well, let's go through some of them. So first, let's talk about Sir Conrad. Alright. So, even though we're not going to go over every specific card in this deck, I just want to talk about some things, and I kind of laid them out in piles for everyone to see. So something I always talk about for all deck building, and I've told it to so many people. A friend of mine once told me, when building a deck, imagine it like you're spinning plates. Every mechanic you have in your deck is a plate that you have to spin and balance. So how many plates can you spin before you lose balance? With Conrad, I specifically have 4. There are 4 things that Conrad's deck is trying to do before anything else in it is just either assist or it's ramp. So the 4 things that we're trying to do is fill our graveyard. It's to play off Conrad's effect and capitalize on it. It's to recur our stuff. And then we try to finish with Conrad's effect. So even though it seems weird to say play off Conrad's effect and finish off Conrad's effect, these are actually 2 different things. These cards aren't going to win me the game. They could, but they probably won't. These will. If any of these go off, there's a good chance I'm going to seal a game out. Not to say guaranteed, but they are very high value cards and must be played at appropriate times because people will be looking to either stop them or remove them. Now, outside of that, I have about 36 land for Conrad. And we'll get into later on in this video talking about how to calculate this, but the average CMC of this deck is actually only about 2. Technically, it's 1.8. About 50% of this deck is under 3 mana, which is really cool. So this deck is actually made to be more of a mids deck. It can contend against high powers, but it has a real hard time, and everything has to be perfect for me to destroy a high-powered deck. This deck is actually a mid-powered deck. The total cost of this deck is well under $100, but it sure can contend against a high-powered because it does have some really high-powered plays it can do. This deck could easily go into more high-power mode if I added tutors to it. There is not one tutor in this deck at the moment. The first thing we have are 2 powerful cards that absolutely can be CEDH even, and that's Mindcrank and Bloodchief Ascension. For those of you who don't know how this combo works, I will read Bloodchief, I will read Mindcrank, and it will become very apparent. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, you may put a quest counter on Bloodchief. When a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, if Bloodchief has 3 or more counters on it, you may have that player lose 2 life, and if you do, you gain 2 life. And here's Mindcrank. When an opponent loses life, that player puts as many cards from the top of his or her library into his graveyard. Now, this is an infinite condition. If you do this, game's done. This hits 3 counters, someone loses life, it's infinite. It is completely safe to play in mids. I do always advocate when playing in mids, let people know if you have infinites in your deck, but also if you do and you don't have tutors and it is just pure luck of the draw, it is totally fair. It does not make this deck high power. So let's talk about some of the other wins. Alter the Brood, Grey Merchant, Balathor. We've got a Perpetual Timepiece, Ghastly Conscription, Crypt Incursion, Morality Shift, and a Cauldron of Souls. These are my majority of the ways that I win. So all of these wins are just basically built around creatures in the graveyard in total, the creatures in my deck in total, and swapping them. Any amount that I can sack majorly on the board, or just devotion to black on the board. All of them greatly cause loss of life and or gain me a ton of life. So with Conrad, they're great win cons. They measure between 4 to, I believe, 9 CMC at the greatest for Morality Shift, which also is pretty much a straight kill for everyone. The next deck I want to talk about is a very common commander nowadays, and that's Chatterfang. So my Chatterfang deck absolutely ranges between mid and high. I can't tell people that it's straight mid. It absolutely can hit like a high deck, but I will say the majority of the time, it still feels like a mid. I don't win early games with it that often. It is very mid-range. It's meant to be my weaker Meren deck. It's meant to be more fun and goofy and flavorful. So you're going to see a lot of powerful cards in it, but again, we'll go through and kind of explain why playing with some of these powerful cards doesn't necessarily mean that it's a high. But then our last deck we'll talk about, because it looks like a mid deck, but I can throw down against CDH decks with it, and I never play it in mids because I will absolutely piss people off with it. So again, I'm sorry, I cannot get this video camera to focus. But again, we're not going to sit there and talk about this individual deck list. I'm laying it out so that I can talk about all the things that are going on with it. So, just for the fun moment of this, we'll put these over here. So this deck list isn't what I want it to be right now. There are some definite changes that I want to make to get a little bit closer to mid now that I've done all of it. Basically, this is all squirrels. Everything here can be considered a squirrel. We actually tried to build squirrel tribal here, and actually what we're building is rodent tribal. My plans with this deck are to actually put in the Marinar combo and put in some Pack Rat along with the Ogre Slumlord and Piper of the Swarm, because I tested it, and playing with rats is really fun. Throw in some Conspiracy, and you can either make all your squirrels rats or all your rats squirrels. This is kind of a fun, flavorful thing I wanted to do with this deck. But even at this deck's build right now, this deck is still kind of on the mid-range. But again, going back to the Splitting Pate theorem, we basically have squirrels, we have draw, we have removal and other fun stuff to get into the deck faster. We have ramp, we have win cons, and then we have recursion. And that's it. You know, by far we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 probably plates we're trying to spin. Because all of this is just the same crap, just not exactly squirrels or rats. You know, just things to help us either gain more life, removal, which I do want to point out, one of my favorite removal spells, Urborg Justice. Absolutely great. It's instant speed. Target opponent chooses and buries any number of creatures he or she controls equal to the number of creatures put into your graveyard from play so far this turn. So, how does Chatterfang win with these win cons? Well, they're pretty straightforward, and you're going to see why I can still call this deck a mid, because we are going to talk about some very powerful cards here. 3/4 of the cost of this deck is right here in this pile. We'll talk about the obvious ones first. Well, we've got doubling, whatever it is. I can't remember it. It's in Chinese. But right here, we've got token doublers. We have Doubling Season, Primal Vigor, and Parallel Lives. That's what it is. These three right here are about $200. They're not cheap cards. Very expensive. But they double the amount of tokens or counters that we get whenever we have a token enter the battlefield, which makes Chatterfang's effect go absolutely insane with any token makers, which I have a ton in here. So these are my engine to start flooding the board with squirrels, with rats, with hornets, whatever, name it. But they're not strictly powerful. However, on their own, they're fine. When I start getting multiples in play, it does get gross. But again, we're sitting here at 5 and 4 drops. These are not cards that this deck is built to play on turn 1, turn 2. I am not going to play these cards until after I can get a Chatterfang to stick. So you're never going to see me ever want to play these cards until turn 7, turn 8. I'm never ever going to play these cards early game. Ever. Which is something very important to think about when you're talking about power level. Because again, when we're talking about when do we want this deck to go off, this deck again is aimed to start going off or after turn 5. Which is why I say it does have some high power capabilities to it, but just barely. The next things we've got are, how do we make our squirrels big? Well, we've got a Stone Forward Masterwork for Mr. Old Chatterfang to make him damn insane. We've got a Caged Sun. We've got a Gauntlet of Power. We've got a Coat of Arms. We've got an Eldrazi Monument. We've got a Door to Destinies, and we've got a Steely Resolve. So you probably sit there and ask me, dude, how the hell can you call this deck mid-power when you're playing the 3 best token doublers and all of the best aggro to go on top of this crap? And then not only that, to top it off with a Steely Resolve and a Cover of Darkness. 2 2-drops, which are fantastic. This thing gives everything fear. This thing makes it so that everything has Shroud. That's dope. So how, when playing with all this, can we still call this deck mid? Well, that's why I do say this deck does have a chance to contend with high power. But again, with what's over here, there are no tutors. There's no way for me to guarantee any of this. There is no protection for this, and there's no recursion for this. If I lose these pieces, they're gone. I play no Eternal Witness. I don't have any way to get any permanents other than creatures back from my graveyard. So the only thing I can get back in this game are squirrels. So we're playing Chance of Draw. We're playing Can't Bring This Stuff Back because I was trying to stay away as much as I possibly could from being a graveyard deck. But what we can do is do our best to make it hit hard when I do get it. But if somebody does remove these, they're usually gone. There is no getting these back. So I showed you those 2 decks really to lead up to this last one. Those first 2 decks are some mid-range aggro and then just some straight aggro. You know, we just show you can play with high power cards and have it be around that mid power. I believe the average CMC of Chatterfang is sitting around 4 to 5, which is a little more typical of mid power, unlike Conrad. But I want to show you a deck that has an insanely high CMC, and I have gotten CDH players to scoop against it because it is very convoluted. It can kill people very quickly. It's actually kind of hard to interact with, and it plays against all the rules of Magic. And not only that, the most important part that I will get into is its optimization. Its optimization is out of control. And that is where we start getting into what we call high power and into CDH, is when you're talking about a deck that it doesn't even necessarily have to play with the most powerful cards, but it's the optimization and the things you can do. And I will show you where this deck just can go berserk. And it's beautiful. So let's talk about Selenia the Dark Angel. So this is probably one of my most aggressive builds to date. In fact, I've had to tune this down to be able to play this deck in high power, because it absolutely was hitting a very clear 9 and almost 10. I could probably kill about 3/4 of the most popular CDH decks out there. There were a couple that I couldn't deal with, and that's usually red-blue combo decks. This deck has a very hard time dealing with red-blue combos. It can get around counters and it can work with dealing with counters, But when it comes to things like straight loss of life and damage to the face from spells, this deck kind of suffers a little bit. If you're playing aggro, you don't want to be playing against this deck. This deck is so anti-aggro and honestly without any stack effects. I think I play one stack effect, and that is Blind Obedience, and I don't even play it for the stack, I play it for the extort, which we'll get into a little bit of this deck a little bit deeper, because we're going to talk about optimization here. This deck on the face should not, it should not be as powerful as it seems. You look at this deck list and it looks like jank. I had somebody rate this deck list on a server once, and it came back as a 4. And, I definitely talked to that deck checker and kind of went through it, and we played a test game, and I killed him on turn 4. It was a very aggressive win. It was probably one of the fastest wins I've had in this deck, but this deck has beat out Paco and Kun. It's beat out Najila. I've beat out Narset with it. I've even beat out just a straight race against, what is his name? Starts with a Z, Zada. I've outraced a Zada head drawing grinder who was going for a turn 3 win, and I was able to actually stay alive after that turn 3 and come back and kill him, I think, like on turn 6 while he was trying to reset his combo. This deck is nasty. Okay, so for the Selenia example, I'm going to load that in the next video. It's a little bit longer, and I do want to be more in depth because it is going over optimization. So just click on the next video in the series, and we'll go over the Selenia optimization.